Good evening. My name is Ben Garcia, and I'm the Executive Director of the American LGBTQ Museum. It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's panel. Marching Mad will be an exploration of the 1987 March on Washington and its resonances and impact 35 years later. Our three distinguished panelists and our moderator have spent their lives working toward an intersectional vision for liberation. In 1987, they were galvanized in different ways by this historic march. I look forward to learning with you all and them tonight about the progress of our liberation and also the ways in which this period is a reflection of the political tensions of that period, as a new set of political actors align themselves against the interests of our community and endanger the lives of members of our families. Thank you to all of our volunteers and everyone who made this panel possible. I hope you enjoy your evening. I know I will. Take care.
Hi, everyone. Happy National Coming Out Day, which 35 years later commemorates among other things, the 1987 March on Washington, the National March on Washington for Lesbian and Gay Rights, which is what it was called at the time. This is a button that documents that. I'm Ann Northrup. I usually introduce myself as a journalist and veteran activist, but the panel we have today, I think, surpasses me in veteran activist years. I'm very pleased to have them here. We are going to discuss mostly the 1987 March on Washington, but it was one of several that have been held over the years. So we're going to start with a few minutes on the 79 March, then 87, then 93, 2000, and 2009, because we want to put everything in context. I'm extremely honored to be joined tonight by our panelists in alphabetical order. Steve Ault, first of all, who has gotten up in the middle of the night to join us from his home in Thailand. Steve is a long time gay and peace and social justice activist. He began with the Gay Liberation Front in 1970 and with the anti-Vietnam War movement. He was co-coordinator of the 79 March on Washington, the first big national march with Joyce Hunter, who is also with us, and was co-chair of the 87 March. He was one of the founders of the LGBT Community Services Center of New York City, and was also part of the Committee for an Open Process, which opposed the Millennium March in 2000. That's a tiny fraction of Steve's activism, but we'll give you a starting point. Letty Gomez there on the left on my screen. Letty, raise your hand. There we are. Letty formed the Gay Chicano Caucus in Houston in 1982. She is a Chicana lesbian activist from Texas, one of the organizers of the Latino contingent of the 1987 March on Washington. She's a co-founder of YEGO, the National Latina and Latino Lesbian and Gay Organization, and was their executive director from 93 to 95. Co-editor of the book Queer Brown Voices, published in 2015 by the University of Texas Press. Board member and co-chair of programming of this American LGBTQ museum, which is a brilliant idea, and very happy to have them hosting this. And worked for the federal government for 34 years, but like many activists, simultaneously was involved with thousands of organizations and groups. I exaggerate only a little. Having to do with women, HIV and AIDS organization, lesbian health, Latino civil rights. It's an endless list, and we're abbreviating it because we only have an hour. And there on the bottom of the screen, Dr. Joyce Hunter. Joyce, raise your hand so people know who you are. Thank you. Human rights activist, researcher, clinician for over 30 years, specializing in youth issues, women's issues, HIV and AIDS, and of course, LGBTQ plus issues. She was a co-founder of the Hetrick Martin Institute, where she and I worked together. She was the director of social work services there, founder of the Harvey Milk High School, the counseling operation, that founded the drop-in center and the homeless outreach program. I can testify personally that Joyce was doing everything everywhere with that agency, and was just a seminal part of it. She was a human rights commissioner in New York City and also on the governor's task force on lesbian and gay concerns, a researcher at the HIV Center for Clinical and Behavioral Sciences, assistant clinical professor at the Department of Psychiatry at Columbia University College of Physicians and Surgeons, and president from 91 to 96 of the National Lesbian and Gay Health Association, and a founding member of the Women's Caucus of the International AIDS Society, and very involved with the World AIDS conferences. That is really a snapshot of the three of them. It would take several hours to give them their rightful credits. I do want to thank the museum for this panel. I want to thank Eric Marcus and Letty Gomez as co-chairs of the programming committee, Max Isaacson and Nia West for assembling and organizing the images we're going to show you and a little videotape. I'm excited for this panel. It's going to be very nostalgic for those of you who are at these marches, as I was and as these panelists were, and a great education for those of you watching who have no idea what we're talking about yet. This history gets lost so easily, and that's why we're doing this, so we can preserve it. And for those of you who've registered, you've also been supplied a link to the Joan Byron documentary, For Love and for Life, the 1987 March on Washington for Lesbian and Gay Rights. It's terrific. You have the full rest of the month to watch it. Please do. It took me back a long way and taught me a lot, and highly, highly recommend it. So that's too much introduction. Let's start talking to our panel. I'm going to talk first to Steve and Joyce as co-coordinators of the 1979 March, because Letty was not involved in that, although I'll ask her about it. But Steve and Joyce, how did, I should ask one of you, but I really want to hear from both of you. Steve, how did this 79 March get started? 10 years after Stonewall, there had never been a large national march by the LGBTQ community on Washington. What was the story there?
Well, I think the energizing factor was the defeat of the gay rights bill. I think it was recalled actually in Dade County, Florida, in 1977. That energized and angered the community. So at that point, there was some talk in a lot of different circles about this. At the time, I was with a group called the Coalition for Lesbian and Gay Rights in New York, and we received this proposal from Minnesota with a steering committee already formed and everything. And we said, well, you know, it should be a grassroots effort. We're interested in it. We never heard back from them, and we heard that the whole thing had collapsed because of internal feuding, accusations of racism and sexism. So the thing just died, and then we heard that Harvey Milk in San Francisco picked it up. We were interested in New York, of course, and I just want to recall a certain meeting. We're having a meeting in New York to discuss things. The phone rings. Remember, Ron Alheim answers the phone. He comes back. He's completely blanched white, and he says, "Harvey has just been assassinated." And you know, we were just obviously totally shocked. And then, we knew we all needed to move forward and start organizing. And so a meeting was called, an organizing meeting was called for Philadelphia. And at the time, whether to have a march or not was a very substantial issue. There was a lot of opposition to it, especially from the main organizations. I think essentially because they weren't running it, they dropped the ball. So they opposed it. But after this sort of tumultuous meeting, it was decided to go ahead, and ultimately it turned out to be a great success.
All of those are themes we see subsequently through the movement to this very day of people dropping the ball, infighting, and arguments over whether to proceed on various issues. Joyce, what was your experience of this organizing process?
Exactly how Steve said. That was the very beginning of us really getting involved in the march. That call, I remember that call, and Ron, Jesus, I'm surprised he didn't have a heart attack right there. But all of us were like stunned. And the question then was, what are we going to do about all of this? And I think I knew what I wanted to do. And I'm sure that Steve, that we were going to move forward, and we were going to, if nothing else, we're going to have this march for Harvey and the mayor too, because he was a good person for the gay community in San Francisco. And so I think the next thing, if I'm not mistaken, Steve, is that we wanted to get in touch with the people in San Francisco. And if you remember everybody's name, I remember their faces, but I'm not good with names. And so then I think that somebody suggested, and you could correct me if right, it seems your memory is really good, Steve, that we have this meeting, a meeting of in Philadelphia at the Friends Meeting House. Is that what happened next? As if I remember.
Yes, you're absolutely correct.
Good. So then at the Friends Meeting House, that's where decisions were made, but it was some fight. There was a lot of conflict. We had problems with people who wanted to eliminate some of the demands that we had, particularly one demand which really upset a lot of the women and some of the good guys was the age of consent, age of consent. They wanted to eliminate the age of consent as a demand to the federal government. And we, at least the women's part of this, did not, and we're not going to go for this. And I must add that the young people who were involved, I forgot the name of the group, but there was a group of young activists. And they said they also agreed with the women that they did not want to eliminate the age of consent. They wanted to, not to eliminate it, excuse me. So I mean, I felt
was it an unequal age of consent? Was that what the
no, they wanted to eliminate it, period. No age of consent. And as somebody who worked with children and adolescents, I was fuming about it, but I wasn't the only one. Eleanor Cooper, Betty Santoro, a lot of the women from the feminist group at the firehouse, but on 18th Street, the firehouse on 18th Street. So that was a lesbian feminist group, and they, who were part of this organizing, didn't want that to happen.
Steve, your memories of that?
Joyce really said it as it was.
So,
it was very contentious, and we changed the fifth demand was changed after the fact. We did a poll, and it was replaced. And in fact, I could even read it if you'd like. Protect lesbian and gay youth from any laws which are used to discriminate against, oppress, and or harass them in their homes, schools, jobs, and social environments. So that was the replacement demand.
Okay, let me ask you a couple of other questions. One, I want to know why a march? Why, where did this idea come from? Because this was the first one.
Well, there's
think-
been a history of marches, civil rights marches, anti-war marches, all different constituencies have had marches. And 10 years after Stonewall, many of us felt that this was an appropriate time to have ours. And also, as I mentioned before, there was the issue of Dade County and the repeal of the gay rights ordinance there that really got people fired up. So these were, pretty much motivating factors. It was our turn to declare that we're a national constituency and we needed to make our mark.
So here are some images from the 79 March. The first one, Phyllis Fry, early, very famous trans lawyer from Texas, right there in the middle in the blazer, leading a joyous parade of people. I remember 79 as being a joyous event. You can go to those other slides too. Barbara Smith on the left. I'm trying to see who that is on the right. I guess it's just a crowd of people on the right. And there's the lead banner. Now, we're only going to spend a couple more minutes on 79, but major organizations, major LGBTQ organizations thought this would be detrimental to the movement. Yes?
Yes, because
that doesn't look detrimental. Look at that crowd.
No, it turned out to be such a wonderful march. I'm sure everybody's changing their idea about what happened that day. But I wrote a letter to NOW, and they were not going to join us at that moment when we were first organizing. And what Frank Kameny didn't want to join us, Bobby didn't. These were all great people who did so much and whose backs we were standing on, necks we were standing on, if you will, but who did so much, but didn't believe that this could happen. It was like they were saying things like, it's just another march in Washington, D.C. And we always see these things. And so it means nothing. It's not going to mean anything. But it turned out, and Paul, remember Paul, he did this organizing of lobbying at the—
Paul Blumberg.
Paul Blumberg. Paul, I'm sorry, I forgot your last name. But he organized lobbying for a whole week from all the different people that came to this march from different states. And it was exciting because it was such a success. The lobbying, the amount of people that were there, and I'm saying that it was well over 100,000 people. As somebody who went to lots of marches, you could see it was people all the way from the stage all the way to the monument. It was. What do you think, Steve? I mean, it was really unbelievable. And we had.
It was. We were told that this would set back the movement for 5 years because it would be a failure. But I have to say one thing in defense of Frank Kameny, who was definitely opposed to the event. After the event, he was there. After the event, he came up to me and said,
"Oh, he did.
I was totally wrong. This was an absolutely fantastic event." So there's Frank Kameny for you, one of my heroes.
The same thing would now actually happen.
And
apologize later.
And in the aftermath, people did go home and organize and get active and start increasing the movement exponentially. Yes?
Yes. In states where there were no groups at all, they had coalitions. I mean, that's what it really was a boom for the lesbian and gay community, the LGBT community.
All right.
There were other issues, but.
Anything else before we move on to 87?
Well, just one thing, and I hope this won't bore people, but it's rather important. What Joyce said is happened. I mean, it galvanized and sowed the seeds of many organizations, but this was all based on the fact that we used a grassroots method of organizing.
Right. That's
where people from around the country selected delegates. And in doing that, they were doing outreach for the march.
Right.
But what happened, there was a move that this was their march. It wasn't the ownership of people in Washington, D.C. or New York or San Francisco. The people from all around the country felt a sense of ownership for it. And all the organizing that went on for the march continued afterwards, where new networks were formed of all different sorts. So the grassroots organizing method that we used, I think, was really effective and somewhat unique. I never saw anything like that done in any of the anti-war marches or any of the constituency marches. So that was a major contribution.
Right.
And we will learn some years later how when you abandon that method, your march fails. But that's a little down the road. Now, Letty, you benefited from this by getting involved in organizing and particularly for the 87 march, but you were not involved in 79.
I was newly out in Texas, and I wanted to correct one thing. I didn't form the Chicano Caucus, but that's where the Gay Chicano Caucus in Houston, began organizing in the late 70s, and around the whole Anita Bryant thing that happened down in Florida, and so that was really around that time period was the beginning of at least for us Chicanos and the Chicanos in California organizing ourselves, and that leads up to 87.
All right, so let's move to 87. Now, I'm hungry to see real people screaming, so let's take a minute to look at that. The organizing principle for 87, just 8 years after the 79 march, was the onslaught of the AIDS epidemic, of course, and the Supreme Court ruling in the Bowers v. Hardwick case that declared that it was okay to keep sodomy laws that outlawed sex between people of the same sex. So let's just take a little glimpse from 87 on video.
For the rights of all the other patients right now.
I'm sick of seeing my friends die. It's a ridiculous idea that we can't get any federal money or any more federal money.
On our workshop in San Francisco and here again today, there's so much pain and so much sorrow. And we're getting through it, and we're loving each other, and we're laughing, and we're continuing on with our lives.
The AIDS epidemic happened and left us because people discriminated against people who are believed to be just about the lowest in this country. If it had been other people, we would never have had to deal with this kind of problem. Now, with the Hardwick decision as well, taking away our privacy, we decided this is the time to act.
How long is it going to take before people get smart, educated people, not just people with no education? We're not talking about illiterate people. We're talking about senators and congressmen and the fucking president.
Our movement has been supporting lesbian and gay rights for over 20 years.
Right now, they just the last ones left ellipse. Between 650,000 and 750,000 of us, the largest rally in the history of the United States.
You could only barely hear Robin Tyler from the stage talking about 750,000 people there. So that's an exponential increase in 8 years from the 100,000 plus in 79 to 750,000 or close to it in 87. So Joyce and Steve, you were involved in the main organizing along with Pat Norman, who we saw, who I'm sorry to say we lost very recently, died. She was quite the powerhouse. And Kay Osberg, also a main organizer of 87. First of all, Letty, you were in Texas organizing a contingent. How did you hear about this? And what was your process? How did you decide to do this?
So in 1986, there was a Third World People of Color Conference in California. And some of our Tejano activists went to California. And that was they started talking about forming a national Latino, lesbian, and gay network. And so then the following year, in 1987, in Texas, we had the second Gay and Lesbian Tejano Conference in Austin, and some of those activists came, Arturo Olivas and Laura Esquivel, and we continued the conversation. So we thought there's going to be a march in Washington. The other part, we were mad as well. We were mad about not really feeling like we were part of this larger movement, and our friends were dying of HIV and AIDS. And so we thought we can use this opportunity of all these people of our contingent coming to Washington to talk about forming a national network. And so yesterday, the 10th, was the 35th anniversary of that historic meeting where we decided to form a national organization that later became GAYLAW.
Okay. And Joyce and Steve, meanwhile, as part of the organizing committee for 87, what was the experience from 79 to 87 and deciding to do this?
I'll start, Steve, and you could finish. I was working, as you know, as a research scientist and a clinician in AIDS, HIV/AIDS at Columbia University Medical Center, at the HIV Center for Clinical and Behavioral Studies. And I kept seeing the rise in cases and deaths. And it was very depressing, quite frankly. You're doing this work and you're hoping things are going to get better, that there's going to be new medications and things that are going to help this thing slow down. But people were dying all around us. And I was like crazed at one point looking at statistics, because that's all I was doing for a while. But I also helped design intervention for adolescents, because I said they're going to get it too, because they're, excuse the expression, they're having fun. I don't know what you're supposed to do.
You can use that expression, Joyce. Yeah. Thank you.
They were having fun, but very risky fun. And I called Steve. I hope you remember this phone call that I said, we got to do something. And then Steve, and I'm sure I'm leaving out a lot of things because I talked to a lot of people personally. I said, we're not getting any money. The researchers were getting nada. Nothing. We were hardly getting anything. And I'm not going to brag about how much the HIV Center got or some other university, but it just wasn't enough. And I told Steve what my feelings were. And then Steve moved on from there. He wrote that paper, and Steve and I, and the guy from LA, what's his name?
John O'Brien.
John O'Brien. The three of us, if you remember this, we went to that meeting of activists in LA was going on that time from these big organizations like National Lesbian and Gay Task Force and some other agencies rather. And so from there, we went there, and I remember we handed out, the three of us handed out this paper that you essentially wrote, and you had Steve and you had John and I read them and approve of it, and we all approved, and then we gave it out. You want to take it from there?
I have a slightly different recollection.
Well, say it how you remember it, but look, we're all getting up there. So we just say it how we remember. But I remember that meeting in LA, and I remember.
Yeah, we had the meeting in LA, that's for sure, but that's not exactly how it got started.
Honey, we didn't start it, other people.
Right, I think the galvanizing factor was the Hardwick decision, which I think came down.
I didn't feel that way. I felt it was about AIDS.
Well, it was both. It was both. In June of 1986, and maybe you recall this, Anne, there was a big demonstration in New York City. I think one of the, maybe the Chief Justice was speaking somewhere, Berger, and he wrote a very vitriolic and homophobic decision. So there was a big demonstration, and I know I was speaking at it, and it was at that demonstration that the call we're talking about, Joyce, that's where I read it. Now, the first organizing meeting did occur in Los Angeles.
Right, that's where we went.
Yeah. Oh, no, wait a minute. No, it occurred in New York. There was an earlier meeting in New York, and then there was a second meeting in Los Angeles.
Okay.
Yeah, there was a second meeting in Los
I
Angeles.
remember it well.
Yeah. And in any case, the difference between the two marches, 79 was a real struggle.
Right.
To get people, we really, it was outreach. With 87, people were angry, they were motivated, and basically they wanted to know where and when. They didn't need to be motivated. The community was motivated, and we knew that if we did it right, we would have a gigantic event on our hands, and so we did.
Yeah, we're putting up some of the posters and buttons, yeah, there's the main, one of the main graphics for the march. It got a little more sophisticated in 87, I guess, but you can see there reaching out to veterans and people with AIDS, and join the train, join people of color, I'm going, National Lobby Day. And that, God help us, was the list of demands. I hope never to see a document like that again, but that I have sat through many, many meetings where documents like this were created to be comprehensive on the list of demands associated with a march, or this is a schedule of march events. The list of demands was similarly long. But this actually, let me correct myself. This is the schedule of events, and it is impressive because there were 9 million things scheduled around this march, including most prominently the display of the Names Project AIDS quilt.
That was the biggest thing.
That was the big deal.
Right.
There was there it is, there's the quilt, and we'll see a few more shots of that. You can see the people on the left. This thing was enormous. And as you walked around those panels, it was just, it was heart-wrenching and one of the most moving experiences I've had. There it is on the National Mall. It just stretched forever. And of course, was only a small representation of all the people in 87, which was still relatively early in the epidemic, who had died and had quilts made for them. And
I remember, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I just want to make sure that Clive Jones, he came to our meeting. Cleve Jones came to our meeting with this idea of the quilt, and everybody really was moved by what he said and wanted this to happen. Steve, you were at that meeting.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. By the way, we had the first march had 5 demands. The second march had 7 demands, so it wasn't that.
I apologize.
Huge an increase.
I apologize. It only seemed like 10 million.
But those demands were very important, and I guess since I wasn't part of the organization, I'm just curious as to how you all arrived at those 7 demands.
Well, the first 5 demands were basically specific to the lesbian and gay issues. But what was different between the 79 and 87 marches was that there were 2 additional demands. One demand basically called for passage of the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment. Actually, it doesn't say that specifically, but it deals with the issue of sexism. And the 7th demand deals with the issue of racism, and specifically, it calls for an end to apartheid in South Africa. So these were 2 new demands that were brought in, and people felt it was very important to express this solidarity. And encompass sort of a greater movement.
And I think this was also a step forward in terms of coalition and collaboration, suddenly you had leaders of various movements showing up to speak. Jesse Jackson spoke, Cesar Chavez, who you saw in the video, spoke, Ellie Smeal spoke, I guess. Was she with NOW or another organization?
Yes.
NOW.
Yes.
So suddenly people, it became more legitimate, in quotes, to show up. There's Joyce and Pat Norman. Joyce, what were you, about 12 then?
No, I don't know how old I was. I don't remember.
And there's Cesar Chavez on the right, and Laura Esquivel. Letty, do you know Laura Esquivel?
Very, very well. She was one of the activists that came from California to Texas to encourage us to organize. And in that shot, I'm glad it's here, Cesar Chavez says to Laura, you definitely have to start a national Latino, lesbian, and gay organization. I'm fully behind you.
Nice.
Very, very memorable for her, because she heard his words, and for us, you know, as just the additional encouragement.
And then you started getting there's Whoopi Goldberg in the middle of the screen, if you can recognize her from then and now. You started to get celebrities showing up, and there's Nancy Pelosi, also barely recognizable.
Very young.
Very young. Barney Frank was there too, and Gary Studs was there, the outed congressman from Massachusetts. So there seemed to be more of people were more willing to buy into this, who were a little more mainstream. Was that your experience of it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. 8 years had passed. And I think I got involved in 1970. And what I basically saw is that first, really to be out was an extremely brave and courageous act. Very few people were willing to do it. And as the first group of people came out, it became a little bit easier for the second group, et cetera, et cetera. So over the years, the movement became, I guess, a bit more mainstream, and that just continued on. So there is a really big difference between 79 and 87. And I think that difference continued afterwards as well.
And I'd suggest that those people, both from the 79 march and then even more from 87, to me, this is the point of these marches. They go home and they start organizations and they organize and they get involved in local politics or state politics. And that is how the movement has grown so big, so fast. These marches play an important part in jumpstarting that kind of activity.
Well, the other thing, this which comes out, I think, in the video, Jeb's video, the National March on Washington Committee donated some surplus funds that they had to organizations, and our organization, Your Goal, was one of those organizations that was to help us start a national office here in Washington, D.C. So, you know, the impact of that march is so far-reaching because of all the people that are brought to Washington. People met each other. People then were motivated to continue organizing afterwards. And I mean, I remember being in LA the following year with the National Coalition of Black Lesbians and Gays and YAGO having this meeting together, I mean, simultaneously, not together, but simultaneously. And we were so motivated to, you know, start working in our own communities to organize, and also because of the crisis of HIV. So I think, you know, what the march organizers did was just create this big catalyst for many of us to continue organizing.
And Joyce, you and I were working at Hetrick Martin at that time, and I remember sitting in that small little office and watching you go through your address book or Rolodex and call activists all over the country after that march to organize the war conference in the beginning in February.
Larry Kramer's
1988.
Yeah. Yes,
Which
I remember
brought about 200 movement leaders to a conference center in rural Virginia to plan next steps. And that was a very important.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but ACT UP came out of that. a coming out day.
Well, ACT UP existed, but
It really got rolling.
Yes.
You were part of
ACT UP
ACT UP, so I know that.
Yeah, well, I joined ACT UP out of the war conference. That when a couple of people from ACT UP got up and spoke, I said, I got to check this out, and went back and joined the next day.
Yeah, Andy Hum was very part of that organizing of it. Larry Kramer ordered us to his house. So he said, it was Andy, myself there at that meeting, and a lot of men that I didn't know. But this war conference really turned out to be very, very good. And it projected a whole bunch of things going on after that. And on that little farm in nowhere, I have a photo. It must have been Andy.
I have the photo too. I'm not going to jump up and get it.
Okay.
Because I want to mention a couple of other things. One, this radical idea that happened at the 87 March as one of those events on that list, the wedding.
Oh, right, the wedding.
Robin Tyler and Reverend Troy Perry insisted that there was going to be a wedding ceremony for hundreds of couples. It was like the Reverend Sun Myung Moon conducting a big marriage ceremony, but people were just, oh my God, we're going to do a wedding ceremony? How could we do that? But we have a little video of that, so maybe we can show that.
Yeah.
Perhaps they would like me to wait a moment while they cue that up. I will tell you also that right after the 87 March, as we wait for the wedding video, there was a huge civil disobedience at the Supreme Court in reaction to the Hardwick decision. And that was where there were things like yelling at the police officers, your gloves don't match your shoes, they'll see it on the news. And really a major civil disobedience, with people getting arrested in such anger, fury at the Supreme Court for being unwilling to legitimize who we were and what we did. And it took another 13 years for the Lawrence v. Texas decision, which overturned Bowers v. Hardwick. We rise in horror now at the overturning of Roe v. Wade, and we are horrified, but it is not without precedent that Supreme Court decisions have been overturned, and sometimes in our favor. And I think that civil disobedience and the activism that came out of that had a lot to do with eventually getting us to the Lawrence v. Texas decision, which of course the current Supreme Court could overturn at any moment. Okay, are we getting the wedding? Maybe. Yes.
We are teaching the world that the word commitment has only to do with love and nothing to do with gender. And so it is. You are together as friends, as lovers, as life mates, as partners. Let each of your days begin in rejoicing in each other, and each of your nights rest in love.
Summer, but a faded rose.
Congratulations, as far as we're concerned and this movement is concerned, you're all just got married. Congratulations.
As for tomorrow, well,
I might have picked a different wedding song, but there's Robin Tyler again leading the wedding. And, it only took us another 28 years for the Supreme Court to legalize marriages all over the country.
Something my grandchildren married Jan and I. Yep. They got their license to do it, and that was great.
All right. So we don't have a lot of time left, and I want to get in a mention of the other marches that followed this. But is there anything more you want to say about 87 before we move on?
There's a lot to say about 87, but we don't have time. So
just two things. First of all, Michelle Crone needs to be mentioned. She was the major organizer of the civil disobedience, and that was just a phenomenal event. The second thing is, and this applies to Troy Perry and also Cesar Chavez, I was just below the stage, and when they came down after having spoken, the people obviously responded very well to what they said, but both of them, they said, I've never seen such a turnout in my life. I've never seen such a crowd. I think they were more taken aback by the size of the crowd than anything else. They were like, whoa.
Yeah,
I like that.
Yeah, it was very successful.
Yeah.
It really was. And for all the right reasons, I think. Which takes us to the next one in 93, which gave a lot of people a little agita because the focus there was on military inclusion. Bill Clinton had been elected president. He had promised to end the ban on LGBT people serving in the military. That was not, let me see what I have in my notes. That did not happen. He sold us down the river. But the whole focus of the 93 March was the military and demands for inclusion and lifting the ban. That was the slogan there. We can cycle through a number of the pictures there. This is just, you saw, you know, Phyllis Fry leading the 79 March, and now we're at the military. It gave a lot of people a lot of pause and a lot of concern that the military was the focus. And the net result after the march was that Clinton caved and they passed Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which stopped people from serving openly. All it did was say, you know, you can't be cross-examined about it, but you still can't serve openly. And it took until 2011 for that to be repealed. Were any of you involved in the 93 March? Did you have any particular thoughts about that?
I attended a very early meeting where the thing really got started. And what I saw was something quite unusual. Now, at the time, this was before Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and the whole military thing developed. People really, when you organize a march, usually organize it over issues and demands and whatnot. But what we were hearing was something very different. This is what we were hearing. I missed the 1987 March on Washington. I want to go to a march on Washington. And then you're also hearing, I'm dying of AIDS and I want to go to a march on Washington before I die. And this was articulated more than any specific issue. And I think that's partially a residual result of the 87 March because it had developed this, you know, sort of a legendary sense of being so wonderful that people wanted to repeat it. As the activist Ray Hill once said, primarily in 87 and in 79, we did it for ourselves. We did it for our own community. It wasn't, of course, we wanted to affect the world at large and the country and the politics at large, but especially in 87, it's something that we needed to do for ourselves and our own community because we're really challenged both with the right wing and with AIDS. And the theme was, for love and for life, we're not going back. So it was a statement that we're going to prevail.
And that was 87. We
87,
have just,
yes.
yeah, we have just a few minutes left. We had hoped to leave a lot of time for questions. We, of course, are evidently transgressing that plan. I just want to mention that after the military-themed march in 93, the next one was in 2000, organized by HRC, throwing out all the lessons learned about grassroots organizing. Their big thing was bring in the celebrities, have a big concert the night before, corporate support. Oh my God, corporate sponsorship of the march. I want to lose my mind over that. And it did not go well. It was not a successful march. And then in 2009, there was an attempt by David Mixner and Robin McGee from the West Coast and a few others to do a national march for equality. It happened. It was a lot smaller. Lady Gaga showed up, but was just standing behind a little podium on the Capitol lawn. It really wasn't much. And it was supposed to start a movement where there'd be organizations in all 50 states, and that sort of fell apart. So there is a question in the chat here. What one piece of wisdom learned during your activist years would you most want to pass on to the current and to future generations? And I would ask whether you think there should be another march or not, and where we should go from here.
I think relationships are very important. I mean, just, looking at Joyce and Steve and everyone that was involved and all the organizing that I've been involved in, we can't do any of this without our relationships with others and, to some extent, having the conflicts, the fights, but coming to some agreements about what we're going to do, because and as far as the march, I don't know that we need another march, but we certainly need to be vigilant about, Supreme Court or somebody else taking away the rights that we fought so hard to all these years to attain, and that we're part of that platform of 87.
Listening to that question, I was just thinking we can't do it without each other and the whole community. If we didn't have all these people that we in that Rolodex that I had, and that Steve's Rolodex, and I'm sure Letty's
Vivian Shapiro's Rolodex.
The what?
Vivian Shapiro's Rolodex.
Oh, Vivian, I love Vivian. Yeah. Wow, you're right. It takes a community, or it takes a whole village, if you want to use that language. It takes all of us to do this. None of us did this alone. We're sitting up here, but there were so many people working with us. I mean, Steve has a whole list. I have a whole list of people that made this happen. And people who want to stand up, corporations, give me a break. I didn't go to the Millennium or those other marches. I didn't go to any march after 2000. I didn't go to the 93 either. I was busy working in AIDS. And the AIDS epidemic was most on my mind. And that's, I had to do that work, and I did it with a whole bunch of people. And there was no, and I went all over the world. I mean, this was a really horrible thing, and gay communities in different countries were also suffering. So to me, AIDS was the number one thing to be working on. And that's what I did. And I don't apologize for not going to those others.
No one is asking you to.
No, I know.
Steve?
Yes. Okay. I think what we need now is a huge national march for democracy.
Oh, yay.
That is the issue now, and it's time that all progressive constituencies unite and march for this one basic issue, which is really under threat. And I think that's what needs to be done next.
I agree.
I hope it's not too late after the elections in a month.
Oh, we got next year.
Yeah.
24.
And what I most want to emphasize from what you've all said is the grassroots nature of all of this work and how important it is. And I've certainly found over the years in my involvement with any of this, when you get a lot of people in a room and are willing to fight things out with respect for each other, but without holding back on your opinions and feelings, good things come out of that. And too many people are too afraid and too dependent on hierarchies. And I'd much rather just throw everyone into the room to figure out whatever we need to figure out. And you guys have all done brilliant, brilliant work over the years. And I have to close this down, but as I feared, we really should have spent about 3 hours on this and not just one. But it's been a real privilege and pleasure to hear from all of you. Thank you for taking the time to do this. Thank you to the museum for producing this, and to all our helpers, Max and Nia and Lucy and Eric and Ben at the museum. Thank you all for tuning in. Watch that Jeb documentary, the Joan Byron documentary. It's fantastic, and you'll get a better flavor of this. And we'll see you all next time. Thank you.
Thank you for
Thank you.
asking
Thanks.
us.
Thank you for putting this together. It was a wonderful
Really.
event.
And remember, we're not going back.
We're not going back.
Not
No,
going
we're
back.
not.
We don't even know how to look back. We're told we can't turn our necks.
Right.